Tonight we look at another really popular topic, and that is fussy eating. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands we are meeting on today and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people present today.
Thank you very much for having me tonight. I really appreciate you all coming on board to listen. I hope that you are all able to take away just even if it's one valuable tip for managing fussy eaters. I speak from experience. I've got two young children myself, and now they are 9 and 7, but they've certainly put me to the test over the years. And yeah, I'm hopefully able to share some tips and tricks, not only from a pediatric dietitian perspective, but also from a mum perspective, because I think understanding how a mum feels is really important. And when I first started out as a dietitian without being mum, I used to speak to parents every day in my role, but I think now being a mum, my messaging and the way I empathize with fellow mums is quite different. So hopefully you're able to take some value away from today, but I'll try not to waffle on too much so that we can get some question time at the end. So thank you for being here. Let me just work out how we can move down. I'm not going to talk about myself any more than has already been discussed, but I'm mainly working online these days. Obviously, in the current situation, I'm still very blessed and lucky to be able to help plenty of parents out there online. So it's actually wonderful because you're still connecting with people. So I'm very lucky, I feel at the moment, to be able to do that and still help people given this current climate. These are my two munchkins, and yes, they keep me busy, as I'm sure your children keep you busy. And yeah, I don't know about you, but at the moment I'm feeling real dinner fatigue, just trying to work out what to serve up every night, day in, day out, food that the family's going to eat. I'm just finding real dinner fatigue. So if you're feeling that way, you're not alone there. So what we're going to talk about tonight, I'm going to briefly touch on specific nutrients of concern, but I'm going to really focus on why children are fussy eaters, and we'll talk about some current trends as to why we're feeling the pressure more and more as parents, when we should be worried and when we need to seek more help. And then we'll talk a lot about the management of fussy eating and tips and practical strategies. And as I said, I hope that you can, even if you can take one valuable tip away from today, then we're winning. But hopefully you can have take away more than that. So if we just touch on a few specific nutrients of concern that the literature is showing that we really just need to be mindful of in our children's diets these days. There's some good data that's come out showing that our children are consuming too much salt, and that's something to be really mindful of in our packaged goods. So our rice wheels, our chicken crimpies, our tiny teddies, all of these processed packaged foods that inundate the kids section of the supermarket, and I'm finding that as my children are getting older, they're starting to ask for more and more of those processed packaged snacks. Often they're laden with salt. So salt is something that is a concern, and we need to be really mindful of. And when we're reading the labels, always trying to choose the salts that the sodium that is lower per 100 grams when you're comparing products. Vitamin D is something that's emerging, that's becoming more of an issue with especially our babies and young children. Our babies, we're seeing more vitamin D deficiency, and there's some really strong research that's showing that our pregnant women and our babies should be supplemented with vitamin D to reduce the risk of nutritional rickets and vitamin D deficiencies in our babies and children. And certainly there's links there to the development of allergies as well. So we see a lot of vitamin D, especially in the southern states, South Australia. I think up to 50% of adults are deficient in winter. And then Victoria and New South Wales are also seeing, 35–40% of the population being deficient. So vitamin D is something that we are seeing more of now. That's a bit of a concern. So we just need to be mindful of that for our children. Calcium is another one that the nutrition survey shows that they don't necessarily meet their requirements, especially as they get older. And iron, we see more of an issue in that toddler age group. So we see our younger toddlers, about 1 in 5, are lower in iron. And certainly in the children that I see in clinic, especially the fussy eaters, often they struggle with their iron intake and meeting their iron requirements because they don't necessarily want those protein foods that are rich in iron. And sometimes babies are still being breastfed quite a lot at the age of 1, or they move on to milk and they have quite a high milk intake, and that can displace iron-rich foods, and so iron can become an issue for those children, and then that has its own issues when children have low iron. So iron's one we need to consider, and fibre, dietary fibre, especially in those fussy eaters that like a white diet. Dietary fibre is crucial for our gut health and in turn our immune health, because up to 70% of our immune system is in the gastrointestinal tract, our gut. And so if we're feeding our gut with healthy, good quality dietary fibre, it's going to nourish our gut, it's going to nourish our gut cells, which keeps our immune system healthy, and that keeps out, pathogens and fends off viruses and sickness. So the dietary fibre, which is also known as a fancy word as prebiotics, feeds the good bugs and keeps our gut microbiome, our gut environment really happy and healthy. And that's something that we certainly need to be focusing on for our children as well. So I'm not going to go into any more detail about the foods that provide those in detail in this session, because I want to focus on fussy eating, but just bear in mind that we do need to be considering these nutrients. So why we care, let's keep moving. If I can hit it. We care because giving them the right nutrition helps them to grow and flourish. It will improve their concentration. Giving children a good quality breakfast will improve their concentration, their mood and their behaviour throughout the day. I see a lot of children have these white processed foods all the time, and their sugar levels go up and then down and then up and then down. And that affects their behaviour, it affects their concentration, and it affects their mood. So we want those more slow release, good quality carbohydrates, grainy bread and things like that, to help give them sustained energy throughout the day. And as I said, support their gut health and reduce the risk of sickness, and also reduce their risk of problems later on. So we're setting them up with really good foundations. And then I guess there's this whole guilt because you think, oh, I've got a fussy eater and they're not doing that. But we'll talk about how we move closer to getting more of these plant foods into their day. So this is the Australian Guide to Healthy Eating, and you'll see this information elsewhere as well. But I just wanted to pop it up there because it's a very good visual reminder of the food groups and what ratios we roughly want children to be consuming from these different food groups. So we've got the fruits, we've got the vegetables, we've got the whole grains over here. And then the bottom left, you've got the protein foods, and down bottom right, you've got the dairy products. And look, milk substitutes can be fine as well, as long as they're calcium fortified. I'm seeing more and more questions around milk substitutes. And I say, as long as they're fortified to roughly that 120 milligrams per 100 mils, that's okay. But we are also seeing children that, for whether it's for allergies or for other reasons, are not consuming dairy. And we need to be making sure that they are getting those calcium fortified milk substitutes, because if they're not, then they're putting their bones at risk. So that just gives you a bit of a broad picture of the different food groups and roughly how much we want to be seeing over a day. But then, to be honest with you, I always talk about a nutritionally balanced week rather than a nutritionally balanced day, because I think that's more real life. And that certainly takes the pressure off parents thinking, oh, I've got to get this all in. I've got to get their serves of fruit and their serves of veggies and their serves of whole grains and their serves of meat and everything all in the day, because that's not real life. We're not robots. We're not designed to eat exactly the same thing every day. So I think thinking about it more as a nutritionally balanced week is a good way to think about it. And that does take the pressure off to a certain extent. So let's move straight into fussy eaters. And fussy eating is a very broad, I guess, term, in the sense that it's viewed very differently by different people, different professionals, parents. Even I see in my clinic, I have a child and the two parents, and the two parents have differing views of how fussy the child is. So fussy eating is viewed very differently by different people, but in general, fussy eating is a very common issue. At least 1 in 3 children are fussy, at least 1 in 3, if not 2 in 3. So it's very common. The stats are certainly there to say it's very common, and it definitely stresses parents out. So if you're feeling really stressed, then you're absolutely not alone. And as toddlers develop, they become fussier sometimes. So it's often that parents go, well, they were eating it in the first 12 months of life, but now they've stopped, and that's really stressful. And it's because toddlers develop a sense of ability to make decisions and say no. And so they realize that they have a choice and a say in the matter, and that can drive parents nuts, because they're like, well, hang on, you've got to eat this food, it's good for you. And parents are like, as toddlers are like, no way, I'm not having a bar of that. So that really creates a lot of stress and worry, because parents worry that their child's not getting enough. So toddlers certainly stop eating a food that they've previously eaten and enjoyed, and that becomes very frustrating and concerning for parents, and they're worried that it will persist into their later childhood. I mean, often it does get better with age. There's a small group that it will persist into their teens, and those ones do tend to stay more fussy, the research shows. But often with the right strategies, we can stretch the toddler's intake or the child's intake over time, but it's certainly a journey. So why are children fussy? So children are fussy for a multitude of reasons. It might be that they're really selective with their food. So they're almost scared of food. There is like a true neophobia that happens with some children. That's what it's called anyway, where they're genuinely scared about trying a new food. And this needs to be respected, because if you push a child in this situation, it's only going to get worse. Children can have like a dislike or a lack of trust in food, especially if they haven't necessarily been exposed to it a lot in their first 12 months, and they're still a bit unsure about that food. So that could be another reason why they're really selective. Children may not like foods touching on the plate. They're really specific about foods and where they sit, and they can't be touching. And that's also very normal for children to want food sort of deconstructed rather than mixed. So it could be food selectivity that's a problem. It could be that they have sensory sensitivities, so they avoid a food based on how it looks. And I guess this comes back to that sometimes that can be that whole separation on the plate. But also they really are specific about packaging of foods. They are specific about the way the food's cooked. Sometimes they can't handle the smell of cooked food. Sometimes they can't handle, colourful foods, and they need it plain or white, or they need it raw and not cooked. So they can be very specific. We have children that are tactile averse, so they don't like sand or slime or anything on their hands, and they struggle with those. Sometimes specific textures of food. So sometimes I see children that won't have mashed foods, but they can have crunchy foods. They like crunchy foods. And I'll talk a bit later about food chaining based on those sensory preferences. And then you've got super tasters, which I recently learned about, that have lots of extra taste buds per square centimetre of their tongue. So you've got all different types of sensory sensitivities that children can experience. And it's not just children on the spectrum, it can be children not on the spectrum as well that have these sensory sensitivities. And then you've got those that just have a general lack of interest in eating for whatever reason that might be. It might be that they're overfed. So I saw a little one today that wasn't so much fussy because they ate a variety of foods. They didn't necessarily turn down a specific food, but she was being overfed. She was eating way too much breast milk, and she was, I think it was about 14 months, and she just wasn't hungry, and she was just overfed. So she wasn't actually able to develop a hunger for solids, which then has its own implications on their iron intake, which is a bit of a risk from an iron deficiency perspective. So we need to make sure that children have enough of a gap, and this goes for toddlers and children up to 11, 12, that they have enough of a gap to develop hunger between main meals and snacks. So that's really important. Then you've got children that might struggle to eat enough in a certain amount of time, and generally we'd always cap it at half an hour. Maybe in some small situations you might need to get their oromotor function checked by a speech pathologist if they really struggle forming a bolus of food and chewing and swallowing properly. But most of the time this isn't a cause of the fussy eating. Sometimes it's an attention seeking situation, especially if you've had like a number 2 or 3 and there's a baby around and they want that attention on them, or for whatever reason they're wanting attention. That can be a big cause of it. But then sometimes they don't have an appetite for another reason. And again, this is more of your extreme cases, but sometimes sore tummies and low iron can affect appetite. Constipation can affect appetite. So sometimes there's a reason why they might not be that interested in eating. So kids can be fussy for a whole range of reasons. It doesn't make it any less stressful. And sometimes it might change the way that you manage them. But on the whole, there's plenty of things that we can try to get the wheels moving. Fussy eating, as I said, can be defined slightly differently, whether you're a researcher, whether you're a mum, whether you're a dad, whether you're a grandparent. And fussy eating behaviours is what normally causes the stress and the worry, not necessarily the overall intake, because even though there is research to show that parents do worry that their child's not getting enough, there's some really good research that's just come out of Queensland to say that fussy eaters still meet their nutrient requirements and they do get enough calories and protein for adequate growth. So the majority of the time, even though there's fussy eating behaviours that are stressing us out, the children are still growing well. When I look at the growth charts and the weight and height, generally fussy eaters will still grow well. And the data shows now that they're meeting their nutrient requirements, but it's the fussy eating behaviours and the food choices and the food refusal at meal times that drive us nuts. And that's, I guess, where as parents, we need the help to build our confidence and our resilience around strategies to reduce the stress and reduce the power struggle. So I don't want to go too much into the detail in the interest of time, but when they looked at children that were fussy, they found a correlation between children that were fussy and parents that weren't necessarily feeding responsively. So responsive feeding is the goal all the way from, infancy. When we're introducing solids, I talk to parents about responsive feeding, and that is being really in tune with babies or young child's cues of hunger and fullness, because as soon as a child is turning or a baby's turning their head away, they don't want any more food, we need to respect that as a sign of hunger or fullness. And the same goes for children. And we really should do that as adults too. Children have a much better innate ability to self-regulate their appetite than most adults. We sort of lose it along the way. But they've got it. They listen to their bodies. They eat when they're hungry and they stop when they're full. So we do need to responsively feed them as much as possible. And that will actually reduce the risk of obesity and other complications later in life. And that's something, I guess, just to be mindful of in terms of this responsive feeding, because non-responsive feeding practices can actually interfere with the child's internal hunger and satiety or fullness cues. So, for example, pressuring a child to eat more than they want to, or using food as a reward, or bribing it to achieve a desired behavior. Look, we've all done it. I'm guilty of it as well, but it's not necessarily the best way to parent. So current trends are that 30 to 40% of children are perceived as fussy by their parents. Fussiness is a completely normal part of child development. Normal, absolutely normal. And that's why the dad might go, oh, but you know what, he's just fussy, he's just normal. And the mum's like, oh, but he's not going to grow properly. So sometimes the same child will have the parents will have different viewpoints of how fussy the child is. But the child is just generally displaying fussy eating behaviors. And as I said, this non-responsive feeding only makes it worse and can increase obesity risk. So to make us feel a bit better too, there's workplace pressures that have increased stresses around feeding kids, especially for mums, because the data shows that mums are still the ones that have the responsibility of feeding their children most of the time. And now there's less time to actually devote to preparing and feeding children, even though we're still the ones doing it most of the time. So in Australia in the past 10 years, there's been an increase in women in the workforce. There's good data to show that time scarcity is a common theme. And we have lots of both married parents and single parents who are employed but still have to feed their children. So they're working more hours, working longer hours, increased stress around work, but still have to do everything around feeding their children. And this creates more pressure and more stress, especially when you finally serve up that meal at the end of the day. The child's like, yuck, I don't want to eat that. You can imagine how that goes down when you're exhausted at the end of the day. So that's where I guess we just need to empathize and go, you know what, it's hard enough as it is. We need to do what we can to make things a little bit easier for us and chop the power struggle and cut ourselves some slack, because we need to, because workplace pressures and transit, now homeschooling, and it all adds stress. So many children are also, not at the moment, but well, actually no, because childcare is still up and running, but many children eat meals outside of the family home. So in Australia, 65% of children had grandparents that cared for them, and almost a third of them were cared for by grandparents at least once a week. And then we've got almost half of children in childcare for an average of 3 days a week. So we do have a significant amount of time where children are eating outside of the family home. And that has its own implications for the foods that they're served up and how this all plays out. I have some parents that email me and say, look, the childcare centre said that little Johnny's not eating his, hot meal, and so they're giving him a cheese sandwich. But now this is a problem because all the other kids are doing the same thing, so we're going to stop it. So there's implications for what goes on at childcare, and then we came to the conclusion with another patient to say, well, look, don't give him the cheese sandwich, because he needs to learn to eat what everyone else is eating, and if he doesn't want to eat it, then he could just eat a bit of the plain rice if that's being served up, and then he can wait until the snack. So we do have to manage not only the meals in the home, but also elsewhere. And also when you are putting in these strategies that we talk about in a minute, we need to make sure everyone's on the same page: grandparents, husbands, wife, everyone that's involved in feeding children. So I'd like to put ourselves in the child's shoes for a moment, because often for a child, the meal can be super overwhelming. It can be really overwhelming for the child to sit there and have this plate of food in front of them. And especially when it's kind of already stressed, going, oh, am I going to get pressure to eat this? What's going to happen? How's this going to play out? And their stress levels and their cortisol's already rising. And as parents, we're like, you know what, just eat healthy food. It's good for you. We know the food's good, healthy. We trust the food. We like the food. We know it nourishes them. That they're certainly not at that point on that journey compared to where we are. And that difference between where we are and where they are creates a whole lot of stress. And we've got expectation here, but they're actually down here in terms of where they're at on their food journey with that food. And they don't know and like and trust that food yet. Well, we do, and we expect them to. And that difference in expectation creates a lot of problems. And I often talk to parents about trying to reduce that level of expectation to where the child is at, and try and put yourself in their shoes for a moment. So should we be worried? Typical fussy eaters will still meet their nutrient requirements, as I said, and studies show that most of the time they will grow and develop to their full potential. The main concern is if they're missing whole food groups. I think that's when you really need to start worrying. So, for example, they don't eat anything from the meat, protein, fish, eggs, nuts, seeds group, or they don't eat anything from the fruits or vegetables. And certainly I do see some cases like that. That's more of the extreme end. But I guess you could just do a quick checklist and kind of go, well, do they eat something from the breads and cereals group? Do they eat something from the fruits? Do they eat something from the veg? Look, the child I saw today, or I saw online, the mum, pretty much ate no fruit except pear, but ate a good amount of vegetables and pretty much all the other foods. So I said, that's okay for now, because she was getting what she needed. But when you're taking out, fruit and veggies, or you're taking out all the meats, you really could be missing significant nutrients. And that's, I think, when you go, well, maybe it's time to go and see a pediatric dietitian. But if they're eating a bit from each of the food groups and it's just the fussy eating behaviors that's the problem, then I think we just work through these strategies, which I'm going to talk about now. So number one, I think we need to talk about is expectation. And as I said, often our expectation is here and where the child at is here. So how do we bring this two closer together so that we have a happy meal time where we reduce the stress and anxiety? And that's really a big thing that I talk about with parents, and that's a big goal for meal times, is for it to be happy, because there's so much research around the importance of happy meal times and the social and emotional benefits to the child. That the research is showing that that's far greater than the nutrients that actually goes into the mouth. So the connecting, the family doing life together at the table, having that 10 or 15 or 20 minutes of talking about the day, what are you grateful for, what was the best part of your day. There's all this data about the social and emotional benefits and well-being over and above the nutrients that go into the mouth. So if we can make meal times happy and reduce the stress and anxiety, then that's a big win, a big win. Mindset is a big one for mums, and I find that it's really hard to shift that sort of story that you've put in your head about your child. So, you know, my child's a fussy eater, they'll eat this, but they won't eat this, and so I'm not even going to bother because I'm tired and I'm burnt out. And I've certainly been there as well. And it's about, and I'm sure that I know that I haven't necessarily served up the same meals for my son, who's younger, compared to my daughter, because she was fussier and she sort of broke me at times in terms of, like, she didn't want to eat necessarily the foods that I wanted to serve up. So I probably then didn't serve it up to him 2 or 3 years later because I knew that she wouldn't eat it. So I was sort of just serving up more foods that were still healthy and balanced, but that I knew she would eat as well. So I think we can get burnt out, and our mindset can certainly play a role in then the energy that we bring to the table, the food talk, and then the foods that are offered. And all of these cues, verbal, non-verbal, and they pick up these cues subconsciously very easily. So I encourage you to just explore what energy do you bring to the table, and how do you talk about even, you know, your son or daughter to your friends, because they can hear that, and that creates a story and a bit of a label, because all of these things play a role then when you get to the meal time, the dinner table. Role modeling is really crucial, and as parents, we powerfully shape our children's early experiences with food. This starts in utero when they get taste through the amniotic fluid, and then through the breast milk, or if they're formula fed, that's okay. There's absolutely no judgment there, but certainly the introduction of solids, that 6 to 12 month period, when they're getting a variety of foods and tastes and textures, all of these factors will influence the child's variety of foods into childhood and into adulthood. And certainly there's evidence around the greater variety that the children are offered when they're really little, the greater the variety of food that they will eat when they're older. And children will eat and learn to accept foods that are familiar to them, the family foods. And it's really powerful for parents to eat with their children, not only for the social and emotional benefits, but certainly the role modeling benefits. You know, we are their role models for everything in life, and they subconsciously see us eating and enjoying food. If they do subconsciously seeing us eating and enjoying food, then that will subconsciously move them to a place of greater acceptance of that food, because it just helps to build trust. It's another touch point with that food. Even if they haven't necessarily eaten that food that meal, and even if they don't eat it for another 3 months, you are still winning, because subconsciously they're building trust. Hard to hold on to the positives in that when they're still not eating that piece of broccoli, but it's so true. It's all building, it's all planting seeds. That means they will eventually start to expand their intake. It's a bit like speech. My mother-in-law was only talking to me about yesterday, saying, you know, oh, do you remember when there was, you know, worry that, well, it wasn't actually myself, it was another family member who was saying, you know, oh, is he speaking early enough? And I was like, he'll be fine. She's like, this is right, Karina. She said he stored them all in his mind, and then when he was ready to speak, then out they all come, and he's a great speaker, and he sings and all sorts. And it's a bit like this. It's like planting seeds subconsciously, food play, all these exposures, and then eventually it'll all come out and they'll start eating. But it doesn't necessarily happen now, and it might not happen this year. It might be next year. So I always talk about the fact that this is a journey. This is not something that is a quick fix. And that's why I never see parents for a follow-up, you know, in 3 or 4 weeks, because this is, you know, months and years in the making, and we need to set up strategies now, but it's going to happen over time. So it's about setting that, I guess, realistic expectation in your minds that this is something that's a work in progress, and that's totally fine. Structure is important. And as I said, we want to have gaps between meals and snacks because we really want them to develop hunger and no distractions. Try and keep the screens off and try and keep them, really focused. Mindful eaters is what I talk to parents about. So really trying to be mindful with eating so that they can see what they're eating and then they can see what you're eating as well. No pressure. The more we pressure children, the more it builds their anxiety, cortisol, they go into fight or flight mode. And look, they're not going to eat that bit of carrot anyway. So if you pressure them, or whether you don't pressure them, they're not going to eat it anyway. So you might as well not pressure them because not pressuring them gives you actually slightly more of a chance that they're going to eat it than if you were pressuring them. And if you pressure them, the next time they come to the dinner table, they're going to be already anxious. And the more anxious they are, the less able they are to even think about exploring food or trying new foods or having something that's on their learning plate or something that's on their plate that they take a bite of and they put into a no thank you bowl. So these are all strategies that are really helpful for children that are still learning. And I talk a lot about having safe foods and test foods on the plate. So you've got your safe foods, which is something that you know that they like and they trust and they can fill up on. Then you have a couple little test foods, a few teaspoons here and there of foods that you're eating, the parents are eating, that they can see you're eating and enjoying, and they can try it if they want. If they don't want it, they can put it in the no thank you bowl, or they can just leave it on their plate. And that's a really nice way of sort of looking at it, is try and have some safe foods all the time and the test foods. Don't give them the butter sandwich afterwards if that's all they're going to eat. Put a bit of butter sandwich on their plate with the other foods so that that is the main meal, and they know that that's the meal. There's no other food. Sure, they can still have something later on, like fruit and yogurt or whatever, but that is the meal that they need to sit down and participate in for that time. So we want to repeat the exposure, and the studies show that we give up usually after 2 refusals, but we need to give 15 opportunities to explore and learn and trust that food. And with babies, we want, them to get messy so they learn about food with all their senses. And this is also the case for children that are still learning about food. They need repeated exposure. So even if they've refused it 5 times, still put a little bit on their plate every few weeks. Maybe do a blindfold game where you each have a go at putting some food on the plate and trying to guess what it is. And you could get in some new foods that way. But do try and sneak in a bit of those foods in every now and again for that repeated exposure. There's even more chance that they're going to learn to eat it if they get to taste it. So they lick it or bite it before they refuse it. But I guess I just encourage you, try not to give up after a few refusals, because just know that they're at this point of their journey with food and they need to get to this point, and they will get there. They just need more opportunities to get there. The division of responsibility of feeding really relates to, it's our role as parents to provide. So we choose which of the healthy foods to offer for that meal. We decide when they're going to eat it, and we sit down at the table, and then it's their responsibility as children to decide which of the foods that they put on their plate or put in the middle of the table and how much of that food they're going to eat. So there's the division of responsibility where it's our responsibility to get the food sorted, choose when and what foods we're going to be eating, and then it's their role to choose of those which ones are going to eat and how much. And that's where we really need to kind of have this division of responsibility. And there's a brilliant, she used to be a dietitian. She's devoted her whole life to this area. Her name is Ellen Satter, and it's the Ellen Satter Institute. I think it's ELLYNSATTER. And she's a brilliant resource for fussy eating. And she's got a whole lot of information on her website as well around the division of responsibility of feeding. Number 8 is involve them as much as possible. And the reason we want to involve them as much as possible is because the more touch points they've got with that food, the more likely they're going to build trust with that food. Whether it's grating veggies or making faces out of, fruits and vegetables, they don't have to eat it. It doesn't have to be at meal times. Whether they help bake, mix cakes, whether they chop up parsley into a pasta sauce, the more touch points they've got, the more likely they're going to move towards eating that food eventually. But it's a work in progress, as I say. So with older children, then you can certainly get them more involved in cooking. And I think that's a really nice way to get older children more, invested into food, eating those foods, because the more empowered they feel, then the more likely they are to try. Number 9 is teaching children how to have a healthy relationship with food. And this is very important. I see a lot of mums and of children sort of 9 to 11 years old, and they're worried about overeating and not making good choices around food. And it's really important from early on to talk about everyday foods, sometime foods, but really encouraging children to eat to their appetite and eat to what they need. Do you need a second serve of rice, or perhaps should we wait for the food to get to your tummy? Maybe let's go off and have a bath, and let's maybe come back later and see if you're still hungry. Maybe you can have some fruit then. But really trying to, teach children, if they've lost that self-regulation ability, and this is more for your older children, to eat to what they need. And if they're just going for all the white stuff, then maybe say, okay, well, that's probably, we might just not have any more white for now, or rice for now, or pasta for now. Let's see if you're still hungry after the bath or shower. And that's a good way to try and direct them off into another food group rather than just more of the carbs. And the whole everyday foods, sometimes foods, is a really good way to talk about foods rather than good and bad. Okay, couple more slides. And with older children, sometimes it's good to write a food challenge plan together with the child, with some small and slow steps to get them more on board and engaged in trying to expand their repertoire. You could consider a sports nutrition angle if they're sporty. In those older children, sort of 10 and plus, you could consider talking to a psychologist or hypnotherapy. If you've got serious fussy eating issues at that age, then I think that's worthwhile exploring the psychology or hypnotherapy angle. Final one, children with sensory issues or aversions. Look, consider whether you do need extra help. Speech pathology, occupational therapy can help there. Food chaining is a really neat way to try to expand kids' intake, not only with those with sensory issues, but kids in general. And that's where you say, well, if they like crunchy foods, let's food chain on. So let's do, if they like plain cruscuts, see if we can do some cruscuts with a little bit of crunchy peanut butter. Or if they like bitter things, maybe we could try olives or jar roasted capsicums in the vinegar, like to chain onto vinegary things. Or if they like salty things, I mean, even though it's not great, we try to chain on something salty just to try and expand their intake. And then you can always reduce the salt later on once they're eating that new vegetable, for example. And sensory food play is another commonly accepted strategy and therapy for children with sensory issues. So in summary, to wrap up before question time, I could talk for days on this topic, but we've obviously just got to wrap it up. But we just need to, as parents, find the confidence and find the resilience to be positive, bring positive energy to the table, and lower our expectations so that we try to meet the child where they're at and try to help them at meal times in a positive way expand their intake of food. And pressure's never going to help that. So it's about trying to set up structure where we've got the development of hunger, and then at meal times we've got safe foods and test foods. We have repeated exposures of food so that children do learn to trust food over time. Look, there's some foods that they won't maybe eat still by the age of 10, but that's okay. They don't have to eat every fruit and vegetable by the age of 10. And getting kids involved can be certainly helpful as well. And really just bear in mind that responsive feeding, because that's a really important way to parent, or sorry, I guess to feed our children in terms of respecting appetite and hunger and fullness. And I guess this is especially important in those early years. But I think along the way, we also just need to be respecting that sometimes they will be full, just like sometimes we're full, sometimes they're hungry, sometimes they're not as hungry. So there's my practical strategies in summary. Look, I've got a 6-week program for this because it's such an issue for so many parents. So you're not alone. There's so many parents who struggle with fussy eaters. I've experienced myself. I know how stressful it feels. So you're not alone, and there are things that you can do. So I encourage you to now think about one or two things that you could do differently after this session today in your home, that will start the wheels moving, start to build momentum, and one thing will lead to another thing, and you'll have small wins, and then you'll gain momentum, and you'll never look back. So that positive momentum really does help, and you'll get there. I'll open the floor to questions now.
Thanks, Karina. That was great. A lot of information there. I'm just going to take back the screen share and we'll do some questions. Okay, had a couple have come through. So Karina, the first question I have is, I have a 4-year-old and unfortunately I've used bribery for her to eat her food, for example, chocolate probiotics. So now it's a constant battle. How do I break this cycle?
So you use bribery for chocolate?
I think, for example, chocolate probiotics. So now it's a constant battle. So she's used food as for example, this is a bribribery. How do you?
Gotcha. Yeah. Oh, you're not alone. Don't feel guilty. It's okay. We can. All is not lost. I think what you probably need to start doing is giving her those. Anyway, if it's a probiotic that you choose to give her daily, give it to her separately to any behavior. Really try and pull apart behavior and food, and perhaps use a sticker chart or a book with mummy or some other nice reward that is not food. So don't feel bad that it's happened. We all do it, but try and pull it apart now so that you still give that to her. You can say to her, you can still have this anyway, but try and reward with something nice and positive for her rather than food.
Great, thanks, Karina. Another question, what's better, blend and hide vegetables so they can eat?
Oh yes, great question.
Or leave it chunky and know they'll pick it out or completely refuse?
Both, absolutely both. So in the program that I've got a recipe book which does hide veggies in there and fruits, but then also I talk a lot about the importance of putting it in whole form. So I think both is beautiful because you can sneak it in and feel good about it, but then put it on their plate, put it on I think platter style is great for snacks, where you can put those plant foods in their whole form on the plate so that they get that repeated exposure that way. So I think both is great.
Great. Okay, I have another question here. Are there any tips for breaking bad routines? So avoiding tantrums and meltdowns, also avoiding them getting hungry or angry, and ensuring they get enough calories?
That's like 3 questions in one there. I think making sure that they are getting some good quality carbohydrates helps keep them fuller for longer. Combining some protein with that can help them keep fuller for longer and can reduce tantrums. Certainly not getting what they want or not wanting that food will certainly can bring on tantrums at the table. And the most important thing is do not engage in that power struggle and that argument. Say, that's okay. If you don't want to eat it, that's fine. We're going to eat it. Just leave it on your plate. Just sit with us for a few more minutes. Sometimes you can use a timer to help them sit at the table. I mean, to start with it, you might be 2 minutes and you're doing well to get them to sit at the table, or you might move up to 5 minutes and then 10 minutes, but don't engage in the battle around food. Just stay calm, no pressure. Say you don't have to eat it. Just have a go, and if you don't want it, then that's fine. And then there's other things we can do after that. But that's where I would start with.
Great. Okay, I have one last question for tonight and then we'll have to wrap it up. So I have a 3-year-old who won't sit for long, but he takes a long time to eat. So we had to use an iPad to keep him still so he eats his full plate, even though I don't like it.
That is a tricky one, because is he mindfully eating then with an iPad? Possibly not. How much is he getting in that last 20 minutes? So in the first 10 minutes, does he eat 3/4 of it, and then the last quarter takes 20 minutes? Then maybe I wouldn't worry about that last 20 minutes just to get in that last quarter. You'd probably just give him an extra snack later on with some fruit and yogurt later on. It depends on what proportion of the meal is eaten within the first, say, 20 minutes. I mean, really, with kids, I definitely wouldn't stay at the table longer than half an hour. So I would definitely chop it at half an hour, but you may want to end it sooner if he consumes 3/4 of it within the first, with the reasonable time whilst the whole family's there. Then I'd probably say, okay, do you want any more? If he says no, I'd say, okay, that's fine, we can have something later on. I think it really depends on how much he's eaten, and really just make sure you probably chop it off at about half an hour.
All right, thank